Hello, beautiful community. You know, as the dust settles on Prigozhin's improvisatory coup or mutiny or putsch, we'll be saying more about that. And perhaps I'll add a word or two more today. But let's start by saying a bit about what a lot of people are worried about, it seems to me, at the moment, and that's the risk that the Russians do something with the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Now, I'm not qualified to make a cumulative assessment of how concerned we should be, but there are a few political considerations I can put on the table. So I have four thoughts about this, really, in terms of how we approach risk, but they're not exhaustive. They're not a guide to how to approach this. They're just, as it were, me saying that I seem to have transparency to some of the pie chart of possibility and uncertainty here, and I'll only talk about that bit. I'm not saying anything of cumulative value. So, two trivial things, first of all. Mr. Putin indeed doesn't care the level of harm, about the level of harm that he brings about on Ukrainian territory. That's irrelevant to him in the end. If it's relevant, it's consideration number 17. First. Second, he does not care about harm on Russian territory. He really doesn't. Unless it's harm that impacts his own odds of staying in power and keeping his hold over his power as stable as it is at any given time. So that's really how he would see bad things happening on Russian territory. It would be a big problem if it threatened his power, but if it didn't, it wouldn't be. The third factor here is really important, and that's that, and we've discussed this a few times already, Putin is interested in freezing the war now. He's interested in holding out reasonably against Ukraine's counteroffensive, freezing the war for a matter of a few years perhaps, and then re-escalating later. So Putin is interested in escalation. Putin is as mystically and, if you want to use that word, and that's questionable, ideologically committed to his project of war and escalation as he was at the beginning. It's a mistake to think that Putin's failures reduce his level of confidence in the significance of his project. They don't at all. If anything, they consolidate it. But he doesn't want to escalate now. He doesn't have the capacity to escalate now. He wants to escalate later. And why is that? It's because he believes with a kind of dogma, and there are even mystical elements to how he arrives at that conclusion, that the West is both inevitably and imminently going to decline. And so you only need to wait a few years for Western support for Ukraine to get exhausted and for Western democratic institutions to wobble, at which point Putin can proceed more freely with his plans and indeed stand a much better chance of challenging Western power and challenging NATO and indeed Article 5. But he doesn't want to do that now. So Putin's view is, let's not globalize the war for now. If we can do something that might benefit us in this or that respect, but it dramatically globalizes the war, it's really not something we need. So that's very important. That's absolutely central to how Putin is thinking. This doesn't settle the issue of Zaporizhia, but what it does settle is that Putin has one important reason at least, and we're not discussing all of his reasons, but we're saying he has one important reason to not create an incident at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. And that reason, that insofar as he wants escalation, he wants it later, and the last thing he wants now is a stronger Western commitment to Ukraine, and he has been, I imagine, pleased that Kakhovka didn't fundamentally change the West's approach. And that's for several reasons. One of them being that actually Western citizens don't recognize the significance of events like this because they're sort of slow-moving emergencies that can't quite be conceived as emergencies. So then there is a fourth factor, and that's that I do think everything, including what I've just said, becomes less certain after Prigozhin's rebellion. So however I would have put this on the table, this third point, a couple of weeks ago, now I'm putting it on the table with just that little bit of less confidence. So I think that overall the situation is uncertain. So that's what I wanted to share with you about the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant risk in terms of the bits of political analysis that are available to me that bear on it. Now, let me just say a couple of words about the Prigozhin situation as we wait to know more. The things that I came out with the next day in the main channel video, and have a look at that if you haven't seen it, I'm still happy, I'm still okay with. Above all, the central thing I said, that Putin's aura of legitimacy has been irreversibly wobbled, and that the question is more available, relatively more available. What if not Putin? Which means that there's a slight effect of politicization, a slight effect of politicization of Russian society, and a slight effect of politicization of Russian political elites. Of course, the majority of Russians were largely indifferent to Prigozhin's coup. And we discussed, of course, in that video that in a certain way, what the Prigozhin situation was a kind of regular modus operandi getting out of hand under the intensified conditions of war, right? So these are sort of facilitated inter-clan conflicts, which Putin normally allows to go on, which Putin referees when they need to be refereed from above. That's where that Prigozhin story came from. And for a while, Prigozhin's position of being in conflict with the MOD was, of course, functional to Putin. It helped get the spotlight of him for the failures of the war. And there were a couple of other reasons there too. But there was a functionality there, but then that mechanism just sort of flew out of its axis under the intense conditions of war. And the effect of that is that Putin's role as a referee has been irreversibly damaged. Right? Let's not dramatize this, but it has been damaged. We have seen a situation of Putin being on the football pitch, blowing the whistle, and nothing happening, or things happening on the football pitch and Putin not blowing the whistle, Putin just standing by or running away into the dugout. Putin will try to compensate for this by getting a bunch of kids together and pretending they're playing football and showing how well he can referee those. And we're going to see him more around. We're already seeing that. There's going to be more speculation about Putin's doubles as a result, because he's going to compromise his quarantine requirements. But his authority as a referee has been irreversibly diminished. And then something we'll talk about another time. This is an event that may force Putin into some changes that he either doesn't want to make or doesn't want to make yet. And here we're talking about further totalitarian turns, militarization of society, and certain attempts at politicization of citizens who are depoliticized. And that's something about which I think Putin is very skeptical at the moment. He doesn't really think that they can wake up at this stage. So something else needs to happen. And he's thinking of this in a medium term. And that starts with the education of young children and so on, fascization, if you like, of young children and so on. As we speak, we're still waiting to find out what's going to happen with Mr. Prigozhin, what's going to go on in Belarus, exactly how far this is going to be a situation that continues to benefit Mr. Lukashenko as it has done so far. And then one other thing we're waiting for, of course, is the fate of Mr. Surovikin. And I think whatever is true there, it is really reasonable to say that Prigozhin wanted Surovikin to be on board. And that if by some outcome, some less predictable outcome, Prigozhin managed to shake up the Kremlin dramatically, he would have wanted not himself but Surovikin in certain important positions. So this is a kind of an alternate reality fantasy of a Surovikin as an increasingly powerful figure and potentially a kind of political counterweight to Putin. We don't know enough yet. Mr. Venediktov, the ex-editor of Echo Moscow, claims that Mr. Surovikin has so far called home only once, and Mr. Venediktov claims that Mr. Surovikin told his family to expect him in time, and answered all other questions just with single word, yes and no. So we'll be following all of this, of course, and for now, lots of love and talk very soon.